Welcome back to part 2 of me predicting every single Power 4 college football team's absolute best case scenario, absolute ceiling for 2026. If you have not seen part 1, it's already out. Be sure to go ahead and check that out after this video. In this video, we're going over the second half of the teams that I did not cover in that first video. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you do enjoy it. And let's start with none other than the Missouri Tigers. I actually really like Missouri. I think they're built offensively and defensively on those fronts to make a decent push in the SEC. I have their ceiling at 9-3. Could they potentially go higher? I think that depends on the play of Austin Simmons at quarterback. If they can have true game records on that defensive line, I think that's more than possible of happening if they do have those. But I have their ceiling at 9-3 in the SEC, and I have the same for NC State. I have their ceiling at 9-3 in 2026, and that has a lot to do with their offense and the fact that their schedule is incredibly easy this year. One of the easiest schedules overall in the country. I think with CJ Bailey returning at quarterback, with the weapons they're going to have offensively, they should at least win 8 games, but I have their ceiling at 9 in 2026. And then we have the Nebraska Cornhuskers. I actually really like a lot of the additions they've made both on the staff and on that roster, but with that schedule, I don't see them winning more than 8 games in 2026. I have their ceiling at 8-4. They play the likes of Oregon, Indiana, Iowa, Washington, and Ohio State this year. So I definitely think there's at least 4 losses amongst that group this year. And next, it is North Carolina. You can say you like a lot of the additions they've made, especially with Bobby Petrino at offensive coordinator. I'm just not personally sold on the Bill Belichick area. I'm going to be lower on them than most. I have their ceiling at 7-5, maybe hovering around bowl eligibility. But like I said, not sold on this coaching staff, not sold on Bill Belichick as a head coach. A lot of weirdness, a lot of strange activity surrounding that program. That's never going to make me confident in you going into this season. And I have the same for Northwestern, but that's actually a good thing because Northwestern isn't perennially a powerhouse. They're an academically well-rounded team, but on the football field haven't been super great. 7-5 I think is best case scenario, and they've been hovering around that scenario with David Braun for the past couple seasons. I think bowl eligibility should be the goal for Northwestern. I think that would be an absolute win for them. And 7-5, nothing to sneeze at with what they have this year. And next, it is Notre Dame, the first of this video, 4th, I believe, overall, that I am projecting as 12-0 as their ceiling, and that has a lot to do with their schedule being not the most difficult. They, of course, play Miami, they play BYU, so there's a couple potential losses on that schedule, but of course, they're going to match up well with both of those teams. They're going to match up well with anybody really in the country, both from a roster and coaching perspective, so I think it is more than possible that they go undefeated at their best. And that brings us to Ohio State, who I would not argue with you if you said the exact same thing. They are a very, very good staff. They're a very, very good roster, probably the best roster overall in the sport. But with how that schedule is going to play out, I'm going to say they lose at least 1 game this year. I have their ceiling at 11-1. And like I said, it's not because the roster is bad, not because particularly I'm low on the staff at all, but there is just too many tough games on that schedule. I think they lose at least 1 in 2026. And that brings us to Oklahoma, who a lot of people are high on this year. I am decently high, probably not as high as most though. I have their ceiling at 10-2. Really like the defense, obviously, maybe top 1, top 2, definitely top 5 defense in the country. But can they take a step forward on offense? Can John Mateer excel into that Heisman candidate caliber quarterback that he somewhat looked like early on in the 2025 season? If they can do that, obviously the sky's the limit for Oklahoma, but not super convinced they can turn into that elite national championship caliber team in 2026. And that brings us to Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State's actually very interesting. I really, really like their offense coming into this year with Drew Messmaker, Wyatt Young, Caleb Hawkins, and of course the head coach Eric Morris, all jumping from North Texas. I think they could be a scary team in year 1 with Eric Morris there in the Big 12, but will I have them competing for a Big 12 title, competing for a playoff spot? No, I have them at 8-4 as their ceiling, which is honestly very, very good for what they've been the past couple seasons. And next, it is Ole Miss. Now, Ole Miss fans, you might want to cover your ears. I am notoriously very, very low on them this year. Not a super big fan of Pete Golding. Obviously, the roster speaks for itself. I think they could win games with that alone, but I have their ceiling at 9-3. Obviously, with a tough SEC schedule, with some key losses both on the staff and on the roster, it's going to be tough for me to predict them that they make the playoff once again. Definitely think that they take a decent step back in 2026. And next we have Oregon, and it is yet another team that I'm predicting as their ceiling being 12-0 undefeated. They are just too talented from a roster perspective for me to have them any lower than that. And their schedule isn't that bad considering some of the other teams in the conference. I really like Oregon overall, really like Dante Moore. Think notoriously this offseason that he should have been the #1 pick in last year's draft. I digress. Oregon, I think you could go undefeated in your best case scenario. And next we have Penn State, and what Penn State has on their side is a very lenient schedule in year one under Matt Campbell. I have their ceiling at 10 wins, 10-2 overall in 2026. I don't necessarily think that will happen. I think there are some growing pains, but they're a very, very good team. They're going to have a high floor with what they bring in offensively and what they bring in on that coaching staff, and with the defense just being naturally very, very good in terms of talent. 10-2 is the prediction for Penn State, but for Pitt, I have them at 9-3. I would project them higher. I would project them towards the ACC title picture. It's just I'm not super confident in Mason Heinzel's weapons this year. They lose Desmond Reed. They lose a couple of those wide receivers. Don't have a ton of talent surrounding him. They haven't had a ton of talent every single year, but they definitely have had proven playmakers at some of those spots that they no longer have. So I'm going to be a step down, have their ceiling at 9-3 this year. And then we have Purdue. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of you guys are lower on Purdue this year, but I have their ceiling at 6-6. I think year two with Barry Odom, they should be a bit better. How much you think, I guess, depends person to person. I think they could end up potentially competing for bowl eligibility, although I would not be surprised if they don't get there, because that is their ceiling that I have for them, 6-6 for the Boilermakers this year. And it's pretty similar to Rutgers. Greg Schiano obviously hosted the worst defense in the Power 4 and the worst defense statistically from an efficiency perspective overall in the sport last year. And it's safe to say they're going to have to get better in that department. I think they will, even if they're not top half, closer to average than literally the worst. I think you could be better. I still have their ceiling at 7-5 though in 2026. And that brings us to SMU. One of the teams I think a lot of people are sleeping on. I think they could potentially compete with Miami. I know they beat them last year. I think it's possible that they do it again this year with what they bring back on offensive line, with bringing back Kevin Jennings, with some of the additions they've made on defense. I think it's more than possible. I have their ceiling at 10-2 for this upcoming season. And next it is South Carolina. South Carolina fans notoriously hated me going into last year for what I predicted for them. I was closer to right than not, but this year I think their ceiling is 8-4. Would not be surprised at all if this happens, because they are going to be a lot more talented, I think, from a coaching and roster perspective this year. Defensively, they should be very, very good. I like some of the additions they made at offensive line and at the skill positions for Lenora Sellers. Also bringing in Kendall Browse is a huge, huge plus for that offense. I think they could be pretty good once again in the SEC, closer to what they look like in 2024. And that brings us to Stanford. I do not think Stanford makes the bowl game this year. I have their ceiling at 5-7, just because not super convinced by their roster, not super convinced by the athletic department, which has kind of let the team fall off, let the program fall into an abyss the past few years. They could overachieve because they do hire Tavita Pritchard. Not a ton known about him, not a lot of expectations that I have for him in year one, but that could easily be a good thing. You could come out of nowhere and surprise a lot of people, including myself. I do not have them making a bowl game. I have their ceiling at 5-7 in 2026. And next it is Syracuse. This one might actually surprise you because of course they were terrible in 2025, but I have their ceiling at 8-4. And you have to remember, this team won 10 games in 2024 with Kyle McCord. That is everything working as expected. I think they could get back towards that range. I have it at 8-4 just because I'm not super sold on the attrition levels of this team, but I think probably higher than most still on the Orange this year. And that brings us to TCU. I have their ceiling at 9-3. Think they could compete towards the top of that conference, the Big 12, with Jaden Craig now at quarterback. Josh Hoover, of course, makes the jump to Indiana, had some turnover issues. Sonny Dykes has, of course, had a little bit of trouble getting them back up towards the top of that conference after competing for a national championship in one of his first seasons with TCU, but I think they could start competing there. I really like Jaden Craig overall at quarterback. Think they could be offensively very, very good in 2026. And then it's Tennessee. This one I actually have gone back and forth with a few times throughout this offseason. I really, really like this team overall. Jim Knowles at defense coordinator gives me worry because in year ones, he typically struggles defensively, but then they kick in the following season. And of course, the quarterback situation matters so much to the ceiling of this team. If that pans out, I could even see them surpassing what I have. I have Tennessee at a 9-3 ceiling in 2026, but like I said, could potentially compete even higher because I love their offensive line. I love some of the weapons they have offensively, both at running back and at wide receiver and at tight end even. So there is a lot to love, especially defensively in terms of personnel, offensively in terms of personnel outside of quarterback. If everything goes well, they could end up proving me wrong and being even better than 9-3 in 2026. And then it's Texas. And in terms of roster talent, you might think Texas has an undefeated ceiling. I am not convinced. I have my questions about this staff. They bring in Will Muschamp to supplement the defense. That should have been a lot better than it was in 2025, but it will be a matter of seeing it to believe it in terms of if this team can go undefeated for me to be able to predict that. I have their ceiling at 11-1 this upcoming season. And then it is their rival, Texas A&M. I'm actually a little bit lower than the consensus, I believe. A lot of people have Texas A&M in that top 12, top 15 range. I have their ceiling at 10-2. I think they take a decent step back based on what they lose at offensive line and in that front seven defensively. There's a lot of question marks on both sides of the football, and one of them I think is Marcel Reed, who had a great start to 2025. I think he needs to be more polished for me to be convinced that they can hit this ceiling, but it definitely is possible for them in 2026. And next, it's Texas Tech. I do believe Texas Tech can run the table. I have their ceiling at 12-0, mostly because that schedule is a piece of cake, and they are easily the best teams in terms of roster talent in the Big 12. I think they could go 12-0. Will I predict that? Probably not, but definitely more than possible, maybe even likely in 2026. And then it's UCF, and this one's actually pretty interesting. I have their ceiling at 8-4. I think offensively they could take a big step forward with Scott Frost now that he has his quarterback in Alonzo Barnett. Obviously, a big question mark was the health of this team overall last year. That kept them from getting the bowl eligibility. I think they could be in that range, and if all goes well and the defense performs to an okay margin, I think they could end up going 8-4 at their best next year. And I have the same for UCLA. They bring in Bob Chesney from James Madison. They bring in a ton of talent in the transfer portal. I think that offense could be one of the more exciting ones in the Big Ten. Don't think they necessarily have the overall talent and overall coaching to compete at the top of the Big Ten, but definitely closer to the top half. I would say it's pretty likely in 2026. And then it's their rival USC. I have my concerns about the skill positions, specifically wide receiver, but you cannot argue in terms of the offensive line, in terms of the running game, and at quarterback, they are going to be an elite offense in 2026. And defensively, they could take a step forward. They bring in Gary Patterson at defensive coordinator. They weren't bad last year, but it will be a matter of if they can compete even higher in 2026. I think they absolutely could hit their ceiling if that is the case this year. And next, it is the Utah Utes. I'm a little bit lower, I believe, than consensus. Morgan Scalley becoming their head coach doesn't lend me a ton of confidence. I don't think he's bad. Obviously, doesn't have any experience head coaching to date. Has been the longtime defensive coordinator of Kyle Whittingham. Could he have been prepping for this the past few seasons? Possibly. Could it be an easy transition? I think so, but still, even with that, I think their ceiling is going to be 9 wins in 2026. And next, it is Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt is very, very tough in my opinion because they have been so good at overachieving under Clark Lee so far. They bring in Jared Curtis, the 5-star quarterback, to replace Diego Pavia. Can that be an instant 1-to-1 transition? I very much doubt it. I think their ceiling is 8-4 in 2026 with some of the growing pains from transitioning that quarterback. I think they could get there. I don't think it's all that unlikely that they win 8 games, but I'm going to be a little bit lower on them than that. And next, it is Virginia, and they're a lot like SMU. I'm a little bit lower on them at the skill positions and at quarterback, but at offensive line, they're just as good as anybody else in that conference. They have 5 returning graduate students on that offensive line. They're going to be one of the best at running the ball. They're going to be one of the best at protecting the quarterback, but like I said, not as high on them maybe as an SMU, who I think is a lot more well-rounded than the Cavaliers this year. I have them at 10-2. And then it is their rival, Virginia Tech. They, of course, bring in James Franklin. I think their floor automatically raises because of the talent level they have. They retain Brent Pry at defensive coordinator as well, which makes me very, very excited for that unit. I have their ceiling at 9 wins, and I actually think they have a decent chance at getting there this year. Don't have the worst schedule in conference play. They, of course, play in the ACC, and they bring in a ton of talent, which James Franklin is notoriously great at doing. So I think they're going to be able to compete in that range, maybe even sneak into the conference title game this year. And then it is Wake Forest. This one hurts me a little bit. I really do think Jake Dickert was the right decision at head coach. We saw it last year. They overperformed way above expectation. I think they could do it again this year, but I'm not super duper high on them from a roster perspective. I have their ceiling at 7-5. If they hit that, that would be awesome, but I'm obviously going to have them a little bit lower than hitting their ceiling this year. I think bowl eligibility should be the goal for the Demon Deacons in 2026. And then it is Washington. Realistically, if everything works out and the defense performs well once again, Damon Williams looks like a borderline Heisman candidate, borderline All-American, which he did look like at moments last year. I think they could end up going 10-2 overall, maybe top 3, top 4 in the Big Ten. Obviously, Damon Williams is a big question mark. He is explosive, not the most consistent quarterback, but definitely he's going to give you a lot of output statistically. Obviously, with the situation they had, it's going to be hard to predict just how efficient that offense can be if Damon Williams isn't at his best this year. And next we have West Virginia. I'm actually pretty high on them with Rich Rod. I think they're going to be flirting with bowl eligibility all season, but if all goes right, if Michael Hawkins proves to be the quarterback that a lot of people thought he could be out of high school, if Cam Cook comes in from Jacksonville State and immediately is a big impact player in this conference and on this team, I believe West Virginia could be in the 8-win range, and that's what I'm going to have as their ceiling this year. And I have the same for Wisconsin. I think their absolute ceiling is 8-4, just because I like a lot of what they did on defense last year. I think they were probably one of the more underrated units in the Big Ten. Now, if they can put together a competent offense to match that, I believe that's where you're talking about them potentially hitting the ceiling. They bring in Colton Joseph to be a run threat at quarterback. How well he performs with his arm is probably going to be the biggest factor, other than maybe the pure traditional running game, on how high this Wisconsin team can perform. I'm not going to bet on them to hit the ceiling, but I definitely think if all goes right, that is 100% possible in 2026. And that is the conclusion of part 2 of my ceilings for each Power 4 team in 2026. Let me know what you think the ceiling is for your favorite team in the comments down below. Be sure to like and subscribe as always, and I will see you hopefully next week for each of these teams' worst case scenario, aka their floor in 2026.